When the corrupt judge insulted Karoline Leavitt over her necklace, he thought he was making a statement. A smug grin, a condescending tone, and a courtroom full of people watching as he mocked the small cross hanging around her neck. "Miss Leavitt," he sneered, adjusting his robe. "This is a courtroom, not a church service. Perhaps you should leave your personal beliefs at home if you expect to be taken seriously." The room fell silent. A few quiet chuckles rippled from the defense table, as if they knew Karoline had no way out. The judge smirked, expecting her to back down, to apologize, to remove the necklace and move on. But he had no idea who he was dealing with. Karoline didn't flinch. She didn't stammer or fumble for words. Instead, she leaned forward, eyes locked on the judge, and with a calm, steady voice, she said, "I'll take my necklace off the day you take off that robe and stop pretending to serve justice." The courtroom gasped. The judge's smirk vanished. But that was just the beginning. Because what happened next didn't just flip the courtroom upside down. It ended with the judge in handcuffs. The air inside the courtroom grew thick with tension. No one moved. No one spoke. The judge, clearly not expecting to be challenged, leaned back in his chair, his expression darkening. The once smug confidence in his eyes flickered, as if trying to decide whether to laugh off Karoline's response or crush her with his authority. He chose the latter. "Miss Leavitt," he said, his voice dripping with forced patience. "You are here to argue your case, not parade religious symbolism in a court of law. If you can't abide by professional standards, I suggest you rethink your place in this courtroom." A few whispers ran through the room. The defense attorney smirked, clearly entertained. But Karoline? She remained still. Calm. Calculating. She knew exactly what was happening. This wasn't about professionalism. It wasn't about courtroom decorum. This was a power play. A trap. An attempt to humiliate her. She let the silence linger just long enough to make the judge uncomfortable before finally speaking. "Your Honor," she said, her tone unwavering, "I find it interesting that my necklace is a problem for you, yet you've allowed other attorneys and plaintiffs to wear religious head coverings, political pins, and even cultural symbols without issue. Would you like me to pull up the footage from previous cases?" The judge's jaw tightened. She wasn't bluffing. And he knew it. But instead of addressing the blatant hypocrisy, he went for the classic move, deflection. "You are deflecting from the case at hand," he snapped. "Your personal beliefs have no bearing on this courtroom." Karoline tilted her head slightly, studying him. "So just to be clear," she said slowly, "if I were wearing something else, a different symbol, one that aligned with your personal views, you wouldn't have a problem?" The judge's lips parted slightly as if to respond, but then he stopped himself. A flicker of hesitation. He realized that anything he said next would expose him. And Karoline knew it too. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "That's interesting," she mused, as if speaking more to herself than anyone else. "Because I happen to have records of previous rulings where you showed clear bias based on a person's beliefs." In fact, she reached into her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "I have documented evidence that suggests this isn't the first time you've selectively enforced courtroom decorum when it suited you." The courtroom shifted. People straightened in their seats. Even the stenographer paused for a split second, glancing up. The atmosphere changed. Because now, it wasn't just about Karoline's necklace anymore. It was about something much bigger. And the judge, for the first time since the trial started, looked nervous. A thick, uneasy silence settled over the courtroom. The judge's fingers twitched as if resisting the urge to slam his gavel. His eyes darted toward the folder Karoline had just placed on the table. A ticking time bomb in the form of documented proof. For a man who thrived on unchecked authority, the sudden shift in control was unfamiliar. Uncomfortable. Dangerous. Karoline let the weight of the moment sink in before she spoke again, flipping open the folder with deliberate slowness. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady, confident, dominant. "Let's talk about what this is really about." The judge scoffed. "I don't have time for theatrics, Miss Leavitt." "I think you do," Karoline replied smoothly, tapping her finger against the stack of papers. "Because I have here at least 5 cases where defendants or attorneys wore religious symbols in your courtroom without so much as a second glance from you. In fact," she pulled out a highlighted page and held it up, "in this very courtroom, just 3 months ago, you personally ruled in favor of a plaintiff who refused to remove a headscarf, citing freedom of expression." Murmurs erupted in the room. Some heads turned, whispering. Even the bailiff shifted uncomfortably. The trap had been set. The judge's nostrils flared. But Karoline wasn't finished. "Here to question that ruling," she continued, her tone sharpening. "In fact, I fully support the right of anyone to wear symbols of their faith. But what I do question, Your Honor, is why in this one instance, when it's me, when it's my cross, you suddenly find it inappropriate." The whispers grew louder. The judge gripped the edges of his bench as if trying to physically hold on to his authority. He hadn't expected a fight, and certainly not one that was so public, so precise, so devastating. "You're twisting my words," he finally snapped. "This is a court of law. It is my responsibility to uphold order and fairness." "Fairness?" Karoline interrupted, raising an eyebrow. She flipped another page. "Would you call this fairness?" She turned the document toward the room, an official complaint filed against the judge by a former attorney, claiming religious discrimination. Gasps rippled through the audience. Even the defense attorney, who had been working just moments ago, shifted in his seat. The judge had been exposed, and everyone knew it. "Your Honor, let's be honest here," Karoline continued, her voice unwavering. "This isn't about courtroom etiquette. It's not about professionalism. It's about you. Your bias. Your authority. And the fact that you don't like being challenged." A vein throbbed at the judge's temple. His fingers curled into fists. "That's enough," he barked, his voice echoing through the chamber. "One more word out of you, and I'll hold you in contempt." Karoline leaned forward slightly, her expression unreadable. Then, with chilling composure, she spoke 4 words that changed everything. "You won't get the chance." The judge's face twisted. Confusion flashed across his eyes. "Excuse me?" Karoline reached into her bag one last time. This wasn't just paperwork. This wasn't just a challenge. This was the kill shot. And the moment she placed it on the table, the entire courtroom held its breath. A heavy silence gripped the courtroom. The judge's fingers twitched on the bench, his breath shallow as Karoline slid the final document across the table. This wasn't just evidence. This was a detonator. And the entire courtroom was about to watch the explosion. Karoline didn't blink. She didn't falter. She simply tilted her head slightly, waiting, watching as the judge hesitated before finally snatching the paper up. His eyes scanned the text. And that's when it happened. The color drained from his face. His lips parted slightly, a twitch of disbelief flickering across them. What is this?" he demanded. But his voice had lost its authority. Karoline didn't answer. She didn't need to. Because the courtroom was already reacting. Murmurs turned into gasps. Journalists in the gallery leaned forward, some furiously scribbling in their notepads while others exchanged wide-eyed glances. Even the bailiff, a man who had stood silently at his post for years, tensed. The document wasn't just proof of hypocrisy. It was evidence of corruption. Karoline let the judge stew for a few agonizing seconds before she spoke, her voice sharp as a blade. "That, Your Honor, is a sworn affidavit from a courthouse staff member stating that you personally ordered the removal of certain complaints against you from official records. Specifically, complaints involving religious bias." The room erupted. Someone in the gallery gasped loudly. A defense attorney who had been grinning just minutes ago now wore a look of pure disbelief. The judge's own clerks exchanged panicked glances. This wasn't just a scandal. This was criminal. The judge let out a strangled chuckle, shaking his head as if trying to brush it off. This is absurd. Fabricated nonsense. An attempt to. Karoline reached into her folder again. Oh, I figured you'd say that, she said smoothly. Then she pulled out the final piece of evidence. A recording. The entire courtroom stilled. I also have an audio file, Karoline continued, her voice as calm as ever, from a whistleblower inside this very courthouse. Would you like to hear it? The judge's mouth opened slightly, but nothing came out. Because he knew. He knew exactly what was on that tape. And he knew the second it played, his career, his reputation, and his freedom would be over. Karoline didn't wait for permission. She pulled out her phone, tapped the screen, and pressed play. The speakers crackled. And then, his voice. Make sure that complaint doesn't reach the ethics committee. I don't care what you have to do, shred it, misplace it, just get rid of it. And for God's sake, keep Leavitt off my docket. A collective gasp echoed through the room. The judge's face twisted in horror. The dam had broken. And everything was about to collapse. The silence in the courtroom was suffocating. No one dared to move. No one dared to speak. The only sound was the faint static from Karoline's phone as the last words of the recording echoed through the chamber like a death sentence. The judge sat frozen, his face pale, his hands gripping the bench so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. He had spent years wielding power over defendants, attorneys, and anyone who dared to challenge his authority. He had silenced opposition. Until now. With the stroke of a gavel, he dismissed complaints with a smirk and buried the truth beneath legal technicalities. But now he was the one exposed, stripped of his carefully constructed facade, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The murmurs that had begun as whispers quickly turned into a full-blown commotion. Journalists in the back scrambled to get their cameras rolling, capturing the judge's downfall in real time. Lawyers from both sides exchanged stunned glances, some in disbelief, others in barely concealed satisfaction. The bailiff shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between the judge and Karoline as if waiting for an order that would never come. Because for the first time in his career, the judge had lost control of his own courtroom. Karoline didn't move. She didn't smile, didn't gloat, didn't need to. She simply stood there, unwavering, letting the weight of the moment press down on the man who had spent his career abusing the very system he was supposed to uphold. The judge finally found his voice, but it was weak, desperate. This is illegal. A clear violation of privacy. This recording can't be used in court, it's inadmissible. His voice cracked slightly at the end, and the moment the words left his mouth, he knew how pathetic he sounded. Karoline raised an eyebrow. You suddenly concerned about legal procedures? That's interesting, Your Honor, because the person who provided this recording, they didn't break the law. In fact, they were working under direct whistleblower protection. She tapped the papers on the desk once more. And here's the kicker, this has already been submitted to the Judicial Ethics Board and the State Attorney's Office. So whether you like it or not, this evidence isn't just admissible. It's already in the hands of people who have the power to remove you from that bench permanently. The room erupted. The judge's lips trembled, his eyes darting to the doors as if considering making a run for it. But it was too late. The floodgates had burst open, and the entire courtroom was drowning in the fallout. The defense attorney, who had spent the entire trial reveling in the judge's clear bias, now looked as though he wanted to be anywhere but in that room. The prosecution team exchanged glances, their eyes gleaming with the knowledge that this trial had just taken a historic turn. The judge's breathing grew ragged. He knew what came next, everyone in the room did. But Karoline? She wasn't going to let him slink away in silence. No. She was going to make sure he faced exactly what he had spent his career avoiding: accountability. She stepped forward, lowering her voice just enough so that every syllable cut through the tension like a blade. You've spent years using that robe as a shield, treating this courtroom like your personal kingdom. Bending the law when it suited you. Silencing those who dared to challenge you. But now. She tilted her head slightly, watching him squirm. Now it's your turn to answer for your actions. A slow, deliberate movement from the back of the room caught everyone's attention. Two uniformed officers stepped forward, their expressions unreadable but their intent crystal clear. The moment the judge's eyes landed on them, panic flashed across his face. The arrogance, the authority, the untouchable persona, gone. What was left was just a man, desperate, scrambling to escape the consequences that had finally caught up to him. One of the officers cleared his throat. "Judge Harrison Gates," he said, his voice steady, commanding. "You are under arrest for obstruction of justice, judicial misconduct, and conspiracy to suppress evidence." The room exploded, gasps, shouts, the clicking of cameras as journalists documented the moment history was made. The judge jerked backward, knocking over a stack of papers in a frantic attempt to maintain control. But it was useless. The officers moved toward him, and for the first time in his life, he found himself on the other side of the law. "No! This is ridiculous," he bellowed, slamming his fist against the bench. "You can't do this. I am the law in this courtroom." Karoline watched, unmoved, as the officers reached for his wrists. "Not anymore," she said quietly. The metallic click of handcuffs echoed louder than anything else in the room. The judge's breath came in short, panicked gasps as he was pulled from his bench, the same bench where he had once looked down on others, passing judgment without a second thought. Now, as he was escorted through the same doors defendants had been dragged through, he wasn't just a disgraced judge. He was a criminal. And Karoline? She simply gathered her papers, adjusted the small cross around her neck, and walked out of the courtroom. Victorious. The chaos didn't stop when the judge was dragged out of the courtroom. If anything, it only escalated. Reporters sprinted outside, cameras flashing wildly as the news spread like wildfire. Court staff whispered in hushed, urgent tones, some looking visibly shaken, while others seemed almost relieved. It wasn't just about one corrupt judge facing justice. It was about everything he had done behind closed doors finally coming to light. Manipulation, coercion, and blatant corruption were collapsing all at once, and everyone was watching. Karoline Leavitt remained in her seat for a moment, unmoved by the pandemonium erupting around her. She had seen power-hungry politicians fall before, but this was different. This was a man who had spent decades abusing his position, thinking he was above the very law he was supposed to uphold. And now he was just another disgraced public figure being led away in handcuffs. Another cautionary tale of arrogance meeting its reckoning. She slowly rose to her feet, feeling the weight of the moment settle around her. But she wasn't surprised. She knew this was coming the second he made the mistake of underestimating her. The prosecutor turned toward Karoline, shaking his head in disbelief. "I have to admit," he muttered, barely audible over the commotion, "I've never seen a judge go down in his own courtroom before." Karoline gave a small, knowing smile. "That's because most people don't fight back. They just accept corruption as part of the system." The prosecutor nodded slowly, taking in her words. "And you? You don't just accept it?" Karoline tilted her head slightly, her confidence unwavering. "No," she said simply. "I expose it." The answer seemed to settle over the room like a final gavel strike. There was no comeback, no counter-argument, no clever retort, because she was right. And as much as people in power tried to silence those who challenged them, moments like this, moments where justice finally caught up to corruption, could never be ignored. Outside, the scene was just as chaotic. News vans lined the courthouse steps, journalists scrambling to broadcast the breaking story in real time. Bystanders gathered in clusters, some in shock, others openly celebrating. Social media was already ablaze, with clips of the judge's arrest spreading across platforms at record-breaking speed. "Did you see her face when they took him out?" one anchor exclaimed on a live news segment. Calm, collected, almost like she knew this was going to happen. "Because she did," another reporter chimed in. "She walked in with proof. She walked out with a conviction. This wasn't a fluke. This was a takedown." Meanwhile, inside the courthouse, defense attorneys frantically whispered amongst themselves. Some had worked under Judge Gates for years, benefiting from his shady rulings and favoritism. But now, with his entire career imploding in real time, they knew that investigations wouldn't just stop at him. Anyone who had colluded with him, anyone who had knowingly benefited from his misconduct, was now at risk of being exposed. Karoline stepped through the massive courthouse doors, the flash of cameras nearly blinding the second she emerged. A wave of reporters surged forward, microphones shoved in her direction. "Karoline, did you know this would happen? What do you have to say about the judge's arrest? Is this the beginning of a larger investigation?" She paused for just a moment, taking in the sea of journalists, their eyes hungry for a sound bite. She could have given them a rehearsed, polished statement, something safe, something careful. But Karoline Leavitt had never been one for political correctness. Instead, she met their gazes, her expression sharp, confident, and unwavering. "Corruption has consequences," she said clearly, her voice slicing through the noise like a blade. "And if you think this stops here, you're mistaken." And with that, she turned and walked away, leaving the world to wonder who was next. The fallout from Judge Gates's arrest didn't just shake the courtroom. It sent shockwaves through the entire legal system. The headlines exploded within minutes. "Corrupt judge taken down in courtroom ambush" trended at #1 across all platforms. News anchors debated how deep the corruption ran, while political commentators speculated who else might fall next. Some tried to downplay it, dismissing it as a one-time scandal. But anyone paying attention knew the truth. This was just the beginning. Karoline Leavitt had just proven something that sent a cold chill down the spines of corrupt officials everywhere. No one was untouchable. As she walked away from the courthouse, her phone buzzed non-stop. Calls from media outlets begging for an exclusive interview. Messages from supporters celebrating her victory. And even a few panicked texts from people who suddenly realized they might be next. But Karoline didn't slow down. She had no intention of stopping here. Because this wasn't about just one corrupt judge. This was about exposing an entire system that had been getting away with injustice for far too long. And the best part? She wasn't done yet. If you think this was intense, just wait until you see what's coming next. Hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because this is just the start of something much, much bigger. You won't want to miss what happens next.